Hey everyone, hope you guys are enjoying Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak in whichever platform you're choosing to play it on. And today I wanted to have a little bit of a discussion topic regarding the 16 new monsters that were introduced throughout Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. That both includes the launch monsters, but of course all of the ones that we got post-launch as DLC as well. Now some of you might be asking yourself, 16 new monsters, where the hell do you get that number from? Well, actually, according to Capcom, such species and variants are actually brand new monsters to them as well. I know to a lot of us old heads or old Monster Hunter fans from previous legacy titles would actually just suggest that there's maybe just 4 new monsters added to the game. But of course, that's not the way Capcom sees it. So in this video, I wanted to have a little bit of a discussion topic. And of course, I would love to hear from you guys as well as in the comment sections. Maybe which one were some of your favorite monsters. But more importantly, I also want to hear which one of these monsters were probably the most annoying, the more boring ones. Certainly, I want to hear both spectrums of things. So do let me know in the comments for sure. Now, we're going to work our way backwards from the newest ones that were released to pretty much the original ones. And I want to start out with Primordial Malzeno because I made a completely new video for this specific guy only because of just how important lore-wise was Primordial Malzeno to the story and the closing aspects of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. They did a bang-up job lore-wise with introducing him, the way that they kind of spun it around from the original impressions that Fiorane had with Malzeno to Primordial Malzeno. And at the end of the day, I do think the fight is really good for what it is. Maybe it doesn't necessarily top Amatsu, for example, for me, but the fight itself and the way that they just presented it, everything around the fight itself and the introduction of the monster, I think it was done extremely well, and it was one of the best closing experiences that I've had for any Monster Hunter game probably ever, and I'm a big fan of what they did with Primordial Malzeno. Now moving over to essentially, again, if we're working our way from 16 to number 1, Risen Shigaru Magala is the last Risen Elder that we got, but it's probably, for me personally, not the best of all the Risen Elders that we got. Well, the next one that we're going to talk about certainly was for me. What I do think Risen Shigaru Magala did extremely well is that Shigaru Magala was already one of the more tougher, just simple baseline master rank monsters in the game for obvious reasons, but more importantly, the Risen version gave him an insane amount of combo attacks. This thing will combo you to hell and back in multiple ways, and it is one of those fights that I think at the end of the day we're going to be looking back and people are going to remember it fondly well, only because of the way and the variety of ways that it could actually attack you, and then the variety of ways that it could like really punish a lot of simple mistakes. No different than Primordial Malzeno. These two monsters, I think, were some of the best fights, again, separate from Amatsu in the way that they handle it. Number 14 would be Risen Crimsow Glow Valstrax. Now for me, out of all the Risen Elders that we got, this one is probably the top of the line for me specifically, only because in order for me to be able to kill it the very first time that I fought it, I had to do this fight with random pugs, probably tops of like 6 to 7 times. People just kept randomly dying to the original combos that I had, and it was just a menace. Now, funny enough, eventually once I went back to it recently with anomaly investigation quests and stuff, this thing just became a little bit of a pushover. People figure out his combos. It wasn't as menacing. And even Risen Shigaru Magala ended up being a bigger threat at the end of the day because it was a more versatile fight. But Risen Crimson Glow Valstrax, to me, out of all the Elders, is the more fun fight, only specifically if you haven't necessarily fought it before. So it's one of those fights that it will really push you, certainly gives you a fun fight. And just the lore aspects of what a Risen Elder, specifically for Crimson Glow Valstrax or Valstrax in general, it would have been really nice to just see normal Valstrax in this game. I think that fight probably been a little bit more engaging. But Risen Crimson Glow Valstrax, certainly out of all the Elders, I'm probably the biggest fan of all of them, especially in the way, and this is something that I spoke about when it was originally revealed. Remember, even in the leaks, we knew about it, but we hadn't seen it before. The color combination with the yellow, the red, the blue, it is just extremely well done. Now, moving on to number 13, Risen Kushala de Aura. It's probably the second best normal baseline of the Elders, Teostra, Camilios, and Kushala de Aura. I think this fight was kind of like downgraded for me specifically only because I don't necessarily think Risen Kushala Daora has a lot of health. It's probably one of the, out of all the Risen Elders, probably has the least amount of health. And this thing has a lot of weak spots. Again, this skeletal type usually has a lot of weaknesses all around it. And Pierce, again, Gunner, specifically what I play, can abuse it relatively well. So for me, I don't think it ever really stuck out all that much. I would only say it's the second best because Camilleo's probably was a little bit of a downer. And by then, we kind of like knew exactly what to expect out of all these Risen monsters since it was the third one introduced. So it was a little bit of a downgrade from the previous monster, which is number 12, Risen Teostra. I think out of the base line other dragons, again, Teostra, Camilleos, and Kushala Daora, this one was probably the best fight, but it wasn't a long fight. I think it even has even less health than Kushala Daora, but I think it was the most menacing one, especially kind of like I mentioned with Risen Crimsow Girl Valstrax. Once you fought it the very first time, you kind of knew exactly what to expect. And it was one of those fights that, you know, kind of lived up to expectations. But Teostra is also one of those monsters that not a lot of people want to hunt, specifically just the master rank version of it. Only because if you're like hunting elders, you probably want to go for like an easier one. So Teostra kind of gets left by the wayside. Lore-wise, I think is the more interesting one out of the three. But it just never really lived up to what the other ones followed up after. But from the base 3 line Risen Elders, I do think this one was the more fun fight. We're going to talk about 11 Risen Camilleos. I think it was the first Risen Elder that was introduced. And it probably wasn't the best really way to introduce this mechanic, at the very least the entire aspects of elders overcoming the curio effect or anything like that, and just, you know, absorbing it for their own power and becoming a separate thing. Probably they could have introduced it probably with Teostra or even Kushala Daora and left Camilleos for a little bit later on. But instead they decided to just kind of introduce the entire concept of it with him first. And he really didn't live up to the fight, the expectations of the standards or what later Risen Elders would do. So out of all the Risen Elders, for me personally, it was the weakest one. It was not the most fun fight. The fog effect was cool. It definitely overdid it, though. And at the end of the day, I'm not a big fan of it. Now, number 10 would be Violet Mitsune. And out of the first original DLC monsters that were introduced for Sunbreak, I think Violet Mitsune was a hit. This thing is a fun fight. Now, at the end of the day, Mitsune is still a typical fight. You already know exactly what to expect. But the way that they handle it, and also the lore aspects of this specific monster in general, the way that it uses gas to kind of like power up his fire, blue attacks instead of just normal fire, orange flames or whatever. The way that they handle that was pretty interesting. Some of the final attacks that it does, some of the special attacks that it does are really, really interesting. The way that it builds them up throughout the entire fight, those are all well and done. Certainly the Hazard Quest fight was one of my best, more fun Hazard Quests that we ended up getting. So I did like the way that they handled Violet Mitsusune's original introduction. Moving on to Blood Orange Bishaten. This was one of the ones that was introduced to just normal introduction of Sunbreak. It wasn't a DLC monster. And I think at the end of the day, it didn't really live up to anything. I think it was interesting. I mean, Bishaten in general, I think when it was introduced, there was more hype when it was originally introduced. But then when you actually did the fight, it never really did anything. It never really felt menacing. And Blood Orange Bishaten had so many interesting characteristics of it, although it was another fire monster, which is base wise was heavily criticized for just having way too many fire monsters. And the fire pine cones were a really cool, neat idea, but it just never really did anything. I don't really think it ever lived up to expectations. It was never really an extremely tough fight. Also, probably it's just the size of the monster in general. It's just kind of small, so you don't really, it doesn't really get a lot of luster or a lot of love. Blood Orange Bishaten, to me, it was just kind of like one of those monsters like, okay, it's a checkbox, you can move on, it is what it is. Now for me specifically, the next one that I want to talk about is Magma Allmother. And for me, I really enjoyed this fight, but I did specifically see, and it was funny enough, when Sunbreak originally came out, there were a couple of threads in the subreddit and even in other places, even on Twitter, there was like a Twitter chain of people complaining about Magma Allmother being like a really crappy monster design and just another pointless fire monster being added for Sunbreak. And I completely disagree with all of it. I remember even pushing back on some posts in the subreddit because I was not agreeing with what people were saying. I think normal Almudron fixed a lot of the issues that normal Almudron had. This thing was just really annoying to fight, but it was also fun. It wasn't just a pain in the ass. The whole skeletal issue, again, Leviathans, the way that they handle them, the reason why we don't have laggy in the game is because of the skeleton issues that they have with these monsters. So, you know, it clips through the ground and all of that. They can't really quite solve it, or they probably weren't necessarily ready to invest all that time in solving it. So Almudron's powers carried over to Magma Almudron's issues, but they did solve some of them by just making this monster a little bit more, I guess, aerial born. It does love to jump in the air, do a couple of things that normal Almudron doesn't necessarily do. And I did enjoy the fight quite a bit, and certainly the pushback from people didn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense for me specifically. The next one, of course, was Aurora Somnicanth, and again, we're working our way back from the newest release to the first original bash. Aurora Somnicanth, to me, honestly kind of falls in line with like Blood Orange Bishaten. It's kind of like the ice version of Blood Orange Bishaten's fire version, which is just another checkbox monster that they added. Aurora Somnicanth, to me, could have been so much more spectacular if they would have done something really interesting with it. But they took what made Somnicanth interesting, which was a sleep monster, a paralysis monster, a flash monster, and they just took all the cool things away and they made it ice. And that's it. So Somnicanth, I do think at the end of the day, is probably the more interesting version of those two monsters. And Aurora Somnicanth is just an ice version of that same monster, which doesn't really do anything unique or cool, which was a little bit of a bummer. But what's not, you know, to be understated is how much of a bummer Pyre Ragnakadaki is. Now, the real issue with this one is that, well, it's not just another fire monster, but it's a blast monster. And Pyre Ragnakadaki's base monster, Ragnakadaki, was already a fire monster, so it never really did anything too crazy out of the ordinary. This was just a meme at the end of the day. This monster really just didn't do anything for anyone, I don't think. Do let me know again in the comments if I'm completely off base with this, but I don't necessarily think I ever saw the purpose of Pyre Ragnakadaki. Even if they would have just done it like a poison version of it or something different, probably would have gone way better than just making another fire/blast monster with a monster that was already a fire one to begin with. I never understood the purpose of it. I was questioning it when it was originally revealed, question it even to this day. It just never really made a lot of sense. And then, of course, we get to Scorn Magnamalu. Now, Scorn Magnamalu, lore-wise, is really interesting. I spoke about it, I believe, in a separate video a long while back, a couple months back at the very least. And Scorn Magnamalu is a fun fight at the end of the day. I did have a lot of fun with that fight. But it is just a big bladed Magnamalu. It doesn't really do anything different. It does the same elemental attacks. It does the same thing. It's just more menacing. So it's more, basically, if Magnamalu gets enraged ×2, that's Scorn Magnamalu. In that regard, I don't necessarily think it was really living up to expectations. But again, they only brought this monster in as a kind of like extension to the lore, which is what a lot of what Sunbreak did. Some of the things that Rise introduced, they wanted to build upon them because they just basically didn't do a whole heck of a lot with the Rise based story that they introduced. Now, the next few monsters are actually what I would consider the new monsters that were introduced in Sunbreak, and these are the ones that most people would actually agree as new monsters to be. Garangom is probably the weakest one out of all the new monsters, not including, of course, things like Pyre Ragnakadaki, Aurora Somnicanth, or Blood Orange Bishaten. Aspects wise, this thing should be cool. It should be menacing. It should be fun. But it isn't. And I personally just would have wished that they would have done a little bit more with it. And it just never really, I think, lived up to like that entire, you know, the big trio, you know, of monsters that they wanted to introduce, the three lords. It was just always just another monster that just didn't really live up to the standards of the other two. One of them being Luna Garen, which for me personally, I think out of all the monsters that should have received a subspecies, it should have been Luna Garen. Probably a non-ice version, certainly hopefully not fire, but something different would have gone a long way. Luna Garen is ripe for the picking, specifically when it comes to such species, because it is a werewolf at the end of the day. Maybe a powered up version that's just constantly up the whole time would have been fun, especially with a different element. And electric Luna Garen is basically a Zinogre, so that thing in a cutscene fighting with a Zinogre would have been really cool. So certainly something cool could have been done with Luna Garen, but the base version of Luna Garen design in general, I do like quite a bit. It just, difficulty-wise, it was just never a tough fight, but it was fun. Of course, the second to the first is Malzeno. Malzeno, I do think, for as introductory of a fight that it was, and the way that they handled it lore-wise, just base Malzeno was done very well. So much of the aesthetic of Sunbreak, with the whole Western theme of, prior monsters and stuff like that, they did a fantastic job with Malzeno, and I'm a big fan of it. I do think the reason why I like Primordial Malzeno even more is because Malzeno was such a fun fight. Such a good introduction to that monster, and then the way that they handled it was very well done. And of course, the first one is Geismagorm. Geismagorm is probably one of the best end-game monsters Monster Hunter has had ever. Now, it doesn't live up to the hype of like the big snake Allmother, for example, from like Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate or Monster Hunter 4. It certainly doesn't live up to that. I mean, that fight is just so unique on its own, and I can't imagine them trying to top that ever, because it was just such a cool thing. I know a lot of people are like big fans of Fatalis and things of that nature, but I think Geismagorm, the way that they handled it, being such a unique menace, and just how big it is. If you have seen those comparison clips of Geismagorm with other monsters, this thing just towers everything. It is the sheer scale of this monster. It is insane. But I mean, Monster Hunter World did that as well, so they always like to make whatever the last big monster is, so at the very least for the base story of the game, as big as possible. And I think that's just the way that they like to handle it. So which is why we always saw it in the arena, and then never really saw it outside of, it's a crucial space, because it's not a monster that you normally expect. It would just tower across the entire map if you actually saw this thing outside of its natural environment. So those are the 16 monsters that, of course, Sunbreak introduced. I am a big fan of a few, but not all, and I think a lot of things could have been done better. But at the end of the day, do let me know in the comments what you guys think of all of these monsters, or at the very least, the ones that you hated the most. Certainly love to hear comments in that regard. If you're brand new to my channel, though, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.